So we have a really interesting panel, one of the last two before the end of the day. This one is a personal favorite of mine. Question of institutional ownership, discussing passive or in some case active investment in media companies and how it affects around the world. So we want to take a look at whether or not this is a problem. We have three very respected speakers on this topic, and we look forward to a lot of active participation also from the audience. Paulo, I'll recognize you first, if you'd like to open it up.
Thank you, Jason. So hello again. So this question, the institutional ownership of problem, of course, this depends the perspective or the market context in each country. In my experience as observer and research about Portuguese market, in fact, today I think we are more focused on ownership transparency. I think in the last years, with the international crisis, financial crisis, a Troika intervention in Portugal, the business model disruption of the companies, I think today the regulators and the public policies are more focused on transparency. Why? Because, as we know, ownership transparency, including the European Union, I think they are more tolerant to the concentration too. And there are many reasons to explain this, and one main reason is, of course, that today the media companies are fragile business. In major part of the markets, of course, there are some companies that they are doing good business, but in several markets today, the media companies, they are in the fragile business. I'm doing a study to Portuguese media regulatory entity, and in fact, it is a strong trend to decline the gross incomes. So if we analyze the last 10 years, all the years, the gross incomes are declining. So, and I think we need to understand that the concentration in some cases can be one strategy to maximize the resource and to reinforce the position in the market. So, because this reason, I think we need to understand the media concentration, ownership concentration into perspective. One is understand the market context. If the market has mass critical mass to finance diversity of operators. In Portuguese case, we don't have enough market to finance, to create incomes to sustain more operators. However, I think our media system is relatively competitive, and we don't think that ownership is a real problem. Of course, there are some situations that we need monitorize, as I mentioned today, namely the duopoly in the radio, and in the book industry is a duopoly too. But in television is oligopoly, in magazines is a oligopoly, it is a oligopoly, in newspaper it is a oligopoly. So, of course, there are dogmatic perspectives that consider automatic relation between ownership concentration and the lack of pluralism. I think we can do that. There are no automatic correlation, and in some cases, the concentration can permit some companies to have resource to innovate and to develop new business and to create more outlets to promote the diversity in the market. So this is my perspective. But other important thing to accept the ownership concentration is create mechanisms to regulate the media sector. In Portugal, I think I'm not worried because we have institutional mechanisms, institutional bodies that they can do intervention if we observe any predatory practice or any problematic situation in terms of pluralism. Namely, we have competition authority, we have ANACOM is technical and communication authority, and ERC in media regulatory entity. So,
Paulo, I'm gonna just jump in real quick. You're talking about the fact that there is regulation in place that is meant to prevent all of this.
yeah.
What happens when the regulators don't even know what's going on? And what I'm referring to here is, Ellie mentioned earlier this morning State Street. I don't mean to pick on them, but our book basically found that State Street is the largest of the institutional owners at about $67 billion worth of media holdings. In many cases, oh, well, this should be loud enough, but thank you, Ben. In many cases, they own small but large enough percentages of shares to at least have some influence and some control on the boards of major media companies. So the question isn't that the institutional owner itself will outright own the media companies, but rather has enough influence to put a bit of pressure on these media companies across the board to exert its influence without outright being noticed by your regulatory authorities. How do you plan on dealing with that, and how does Portugal and how should countries deal with it?
I think it's not exactly because we have some situation. We had some situation in Portugal that the regulation made a good intervention in the market. For example, 4 years ago, a private company that has a strong position in commercial television, they tried to acquire a second position in the private television, and if the regulators permitted this acquisition, that company will had a strong position in two private channels. So, okay. And the Portuguese authority regulators stopped this kind of situation. So, if you want to acquire a new position in a new company, you need to sell your position in the other company. So
you're saying that the institution owner had to sell their position in one company to protect if they wanted to go into company two.
There are other interesting things.
Is there a threshold on that?
Sorry?
Is there a threshold that if they own more than 5% or they plan on buying more?
Yeah, 30%. We are talking about 30%. So 30% in one company and 30% in the other company. So 60% into private companies. So will be a strong position in.
And this goes to the point that I was making earlier. The 30% isn't needed to exert control. In many cases, for a major company, you may only need 5% to be able to exert at least influence on the company. So 30% is actually a very, very high mark. Are we seeing any issues where that 30% number maybe needs to come down a bit to prevent issues?
Yeah. Yeah, it depends on the context. Of course, 30% is higher market, higher position, but Portuguese media system, we don't have much options. So we need to be at tolerance with the concentration because, as I mentioned, the market is small. But other interesting point is that the media authority regulator, for example, about public media service, did a report that concluded that the government party, the number of hours, the number of attention, the audience from the government party was higher comparing with others, opposition, other parts. So they recommended to public media service to divide better the time for the cover from the activities from each part. So this is a kind of recommendation that I think can, in some situation, can be pedagogic.
Great.
It's not authority regulator, but pedagogic regulation. I believe in pedagogic regulation and co-regulation, cooperation between private companies and the state. I think there are some situations that the regulation can run well. So, but other thing that I would like to explain about the institutional perspective of media sector in Portugal, and to explain because today we don't consider the ownership in general approach a problematic situation is because our public policies are worried to help the media industry how they can improve the business. For example, the Portuguese government, of course, was not only the last Portuguese government, but the two last Portuguese government, they created with European funds, one part of European funds, a program to stimulate the media industry. We are creating a cluster, creative cluster in Portugal where we can include the media. They created a program to incentive the media industry to export contents, to go outside. So this is a part of the perspective that we need to understand that is a difficult business, especially in small market, and we need incentive the business, media business, to go out of domestic market. So this is an important perspective in my view, because the companies today in Portugal, if they want to grow, they need to go outside of Portugal, because the market, domestic market, is stagnated. So I mention this because I think today is important to understand the pluralism problems, the social perspective, reception perspective, but we need to understand also the business perspective. And I think in some discussion, namely from Frankfurt inspiration, they don't understand this kind of necessity to understand the business. And sometimes the concentration is almost a unique strategy to survive and to be relevant to the market. So, okay. 1 minute to conclude.
30 seconds.
Basically, in Portugal, we are focused, and I think the governments, two main governments in Portugal, they are in fact focused on to help the media industry to go out. Of course, today we observe that the same idea that Alfonso today mentioned. The companies are focused on cash cow because they don't have money to invest in the new business, in innovation. This is a Portuguese case. So if they want to internationalize, they need state support because they don't have enough resource today to have internationalization. And it is the reason because the Portuguese government create a cluster to help creative industry and media to go outside. Of course, the question is, what will be the impact of the subsidies, and it will be sustainable for the future? We don't know, but we need to do experience, and if the state can help other industries, why not media industry? This is other important thing. In the past, the media industry was perceived as a cultural industry, and today is perceived as an industry that need be profitable and that need be strategies to go and internationalize. So thank you.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Sergio. Sergio, I don't think you have any slides, right?
No.
But you don't? No. Okay, great.
Just to be more dynamic.
Sure. Plus, it feels good to get up, sitting all day.
I promise to be short.
Let's put this up and go ahead. So you got that.
Thanks. I will speak again from the Latin American perspective. The question, is the institutional ownership a problem? It's a very ideological kind of question, and you will get an ideological answer. Especially in Latin America, it's a kind of question that in academia would raise some kind of suspicions. Most of the academics in Latin American universities are sort of so-called the critical line, and they are suspicious of these capitalistic ways of solving things. But I would say in general, my appreciation after analyzing the data in the book, and I won't repeat what's being put there, is I would say it's not a bad thing per se. And I think the point is basically keeping biodiversity of the system, the ecosystem of media, especially in content media. Platform media, of course, much more institutionalized and mostly controlled by international ventures. In the case of Chile, it's a very open economy, so we are very exposed to that. But in terms of the content media, I think, and especially considering the experience after the Pinochet dictatorship, it was a way of getting fresh views that put some dynamism into the media market. With a less conservative view, we had some Venezuelan conglomerates coming, Spanish conglomerates, they already still control radio, mostly, and from other countries as well. So I would say the only point is something that Hussein said some time ago, that the point is trying not to rely on just one paradigm. Institutional ownership, as it's well described in the book, really means that it's a profit-oriented mentality, especially in a short term. So that may be a good thing if there's something else around to counteract that logic. And I think that, and that's an ideological response. Many colleagues of mine in Argentinian or Brazilian universities wouldn't agree with me, but I am a Chilean, so I'm more market-oriented. And I would say from traditionally, for you to understand what this means in the region, you had initially private organizations that had a very, I would say, unaccountable and excessive power in their environment. They modified constitutions, they accommodated with dictators and all that, and if not dictators, corrupted governments. So saying a private venture is not necessarily a good thing in the Latin American environment. On the other hand, state and public ownership was not a guarantee of also accountability or citizen responsibilities. The public interest, basically vested interests of governments, sometimes weak, sometimes corrupted, sometimes dictatorial. Historically, the Catholic Church was a very important actor, not anymore because of the pedophilia scandals and all that, but used to be a very, very relevant actor in this field, and not only in the media, but also providing healthcare and education. Nowadays, the Protestant and evangelical churches have many small outlets, and they are relevant in countries like Brazil. But nowadays, especially the alternative critical people are putting up an agenda of fostering the third sector, the citizen and community media outlets. In my opinion, at least in Chile, they are very marginal. So, but in other countries, they are more strong. And you should understand also as well that there are some very significant countries, they are not the biggest ones, but significant countries that produce a climate of policy discussion around, I am speaking about the so-called neo-populist regimes of Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. Argentina is the largest country of all of them, and please consider and remember they are democratic regimes. Possibly the most controversial case is Venezuela, when the Hugo Chavez, the president, closed the RCTV, he cut off the franchise, the terrestrial franchise that operator had, but also because RCTV supported a failed coup attempt some years before. The logic in the way that the government made its claims and his reasons for closing this and not renewing the franchise was curiously very similar to one that used by Pinochet in 1979 to do the same with an opposing radio network. So to sum up everything, I would say that in the region, at least in Chile, I think that institutional ownership can be a source of diversity, of renewal, but at the same time, if it's not weighted down with these other considerations, could be problematic. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. The final speaker for this panel is Ben, to give us the U.S. version, if you will. The U.S. voice. We heard from Europe. We've heard from
US version.
Latin America. So now I'm interested to hear your take as well. And
I think a lot of the answer to the question is very culturally based, depending on where you come from. As they say, where you stand depends on where you sit. And I tend to come out fairly close to Sergio's point of view, even though we sit in different places. In 1979, I published the first edition of Who Owns the Media, and when it was reviewed, we put it together very quickly in response to some things going on at the Federal Trade Commission and some high interest. When it was reviewed, one of the reviewers said, well, you did a good job of talking about who owns what, Gannett and CBS and so forth, but you didn't address at all who owns those companies. And I said, whoa, yeah, you know, I talked about the corporate owners, but not the stock owners. So we quickly put together a second edition and looked at the institutional owners. And so I found that companies like Capital Group, State Street, and those folks that, Ellie mentioned some this morning. So I am very, this is something I've thought a lot about for quite a while. There are three major kinds of owners you can have. You can have individual family owners who own privately held corporations and control those. You can have institutions, or you can have the government, state, or as I mentioned earlier, could be municipalities or regions, but government owned. There's some other possibilities. Sometimes employees can own a business, unions, but those can be there. They have their own drawbacks, but they're pretty small. So we're going to talk about the three major possibilities. In the book, talk about there are, despite this notion of all the media moguls, there are really 56 individuals or families that you can consider billionaires in dollars, I assume, based on their media holdings. Of those, 60% of those are outside the U.S., which means 40% are U.S. based. Just to break that down, 37 of those created media properties, not inherited them. So they're entrepreneurs that grew. Most of the new billionaires are there through mobile telecom or information services. As I said, 40% are U.S. citizens, 22, 4 from Japan, 4 from France, a third are in developing countries, in the BRICS. The top 10 individuals account, depending on how you figure out value, the top 10 individuals account for 5 to 10% of the media revenue from the 30 countries examined here. So this is the base of them. Institutional owners are largely investment groups, such as State Street, Capital Group, Fidelity, around the world. They, of course, are not investing their own money. It's the money of individuals, wealthy individuals, you and me. I assume that, like me, you're not wealthy. It includes pension funds, endowments from universities and foundations. It's teachers' unions. CalPERS in California is one of the largest pension funds, and it's an aggregation of teachers' savings for their retirement. So a lot of individuals don't even realize they have a stake in what goes on here. 73% of the 30 largest asset management companies are U.S. based. What a lot of folks don't realize is that if media companies do well, a lot of individuals will have better retirements than if they don't do well. A lot of individuals don't realize that. This is, what is that? What did I do there? I mentioned, 73% of the top investment management companies are headquartered in the U.S. And this is the range. The estimate of the value depends on how you impute value. So the full bar is the high range of the value of those 30 top, and the blue bar is the low value. So it's a range of those. Not terribly important. The top 30 individual owners account for 18 to 16%. That's what we see here. Institutional owners 10 to 19. I may have put the wrong numbers on that. Never mind. These are the numbers. The government 13%. That's right. Institutional 10 to 19. I don't know. I probably pushed the wrong button on PowerPoint. Sorry about that. So the outlook based on research from the book is that in the developed world, institutional ownership is likely to grow its share, and the state share is likely to decline. Individual non-entrepreneurial ownership should probably decline, although that can be slowed somewhat by, Ellie mentioned this morning, multiple share classes where folks like Google and New York Times, they maintain control through super voting shares. So that can mitigate against that trend. Concentration in institutional ownership, like government and concentration, are closely associated. Entrepreneurial ownership grows during periods of innovation, which we're currently in. We've heard about the myth of the domination by media moguls, and I think this information gives substance to that. We keep hearing about the Murdoch and Redstone and Berlusconi, and I think that's a very dated view given the prevalence of the institutional investors, the dot-com startups, and national governments. So finally, is institutional ownership a problem? Well, it's not perfect. I mean, there's no perfect answer here, and there's always going to be a mix. But I've been looking at this for years and doing I would say dozens, if not scores of case studies of looking at companies and how they, especially content companies, and how they behave. And there's this image of the privately owned company, locally owned company, and we say, oh, you know, that's sort of perhaps the ideal. But you see so many stories of the locally owned media company, newspaper, radio, whatever. The owner of the company, the family has been in town for a long time. They know the place. That's good. But that means they also went to school with the local banker and the local real estate developers. And there's always the temptation, if the newspaper or the radio or the TV news is going to do an expose over the real estate developer doing some flim-flam, there's always the pressure, is the publisher going to allow that to happen? On the other hand, if you have institutional investors who aren't looking over their shoulder, there's just professional managers there, they're much more likely to say, well, if this is going to sell newspapers or increase viewership, that's probably good. If the institutional investors are interested in ROI, then the local managers are going to do what's ever good to grow the business. If that means localism, that's what they're going to do. So you can see problems with absentee owners, institutional investors, but if I had a choice between ownership of a profit motive owner, an institutional owner, or a local owner or a private owner who is motivated by ideology or an agenda, given those choices, I think better for the content side, the media side, is to have the institutional investors, other things being equal. So with that, I have some questions.
Thanks, Ben. So I'd like to open it up. Any questions from the audience? Any? Ellie, you got one? Or are you just stretching?
But the question is about this panel and the previous one. I don't know if that's allowed or not.
Sure.
Is it?
I'll allow it.
Okay, when I arrived here, I was listening to Ellie saying that we should compare apples with apples. And what happened here is that sometimes I see that we are comparing apples with chicken. And again, I would like to make a distinction between content media and platform media. Because when we speak about content media and regulation and ownership, we have always the logic of market share. More than whatever is too much. That depends on the country, because Paulo said, in our country, we tolerate a high level of concentration because we want to be competitive. Okay, that has a logic. But again, with content media, the logic is market share. But with platform media, what we have is basically natural monopolies. And the comparison with platform media, like ISP or search engines or wherever, the comparison may be railways, cable operators, or gas or water companies. And I do not expect to have 20 railways from my city to the capital. What I expect is the regulation of the use of the natural monopoly. So one of the, I think that of the confusions here is that sometimes we apply the logic of the old media, of the legacy media, which is the media which provide news and entertainment, with the logic of natural monopolies. Okay, that's very much linked to the previous panel, but I like just to make the comment.
Anybody want to respond from the panel?
No, I agree. I think that's worthwhile. Still, I was addressing primarily the content media, apples to apples. Although I think we know that the capital needs of the platform and the infrastructure are so great that you're going to have the concentration, and again, who owns that? I mean, even companies like Verizon have so many stockholders that it's the real owners of Verizon are, no one has more than what, 1% or 2% of that. But yeah, let that go.
Sergio?
Yeah, I agree with what you said, and that's why I made the distinction that I was speaking about content media. But in the terms of platform media and regulating monopolies, that's where I would say the quality of the state's institution and the rule of the law is paramount. We have been in Chile done very interesting work on privatizing roads, infrastructure building and all that. We have learned quite a lot throughout the process, but actually the quality of regulation and the conditions that you set up for private providers has been very useful. But this is a very small area, so it's not as developed as public infrastructure and other sectors. But I agree with you.
I agree too, of course. In Portugal, today we have a discussion to merge the media regulatory entity with the communication entity. So, and there are two positions that if we do it, the future regulator body will serve the telecommunication industry. The media people think that if the media regulatory body will integrate the communication regulatory body, will be a lack of regulation about content. So, in fact, I agree with we need to separate, but in Portugal, one situation that I'm a little bit worried is about this, is if in the future, if they merge, we will regulate the contents, because the communication body has power, has money, and will defend the interests of the telecommunication industry. So, but of course, it is important to define the content and other platforms. Okay, I agree with the position of Alphonse.
Great. Thank you, Paulo. We have time for one more question. Dwayne?
It's a question directed mostly for Ben, but Sergio, Paulo, feel free to kind of chime in. I recently looked at some Canadian data, and I haven't fully kind of digested it yet. But, you know, as we talk here, as you talked about, you know, individual companies and institutional investors in individual companies. What I saw was that the same institutional investors, so the Royal Bank in Canada, the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, had the most significant shares on, say, Bell, our largest players, basically, Bell, TELUS, and Rogers, and they were fairly significant, 7 or 8%. And so does it make a difference now? What do you make of this kind of, it's a relational type thing. It's not just individual companies, but they have it on 2 or 3 players. And in the back of my mind, which is, you know, kind of animated by hermeneutics of suspicion, if you will, I remember J.P. Morgan, you know, back in the day, you know, kind of late 19th, early 20th century, saying, you know, you must avoid ruinous competition. And so, you know, what do you make of this situation? If you saw what I...
Well, first, you know, Canada, being a smaller market, is a little different, but even then, you said 7 or 8%. Most institutions don't buy more than 5% in any, they want to be much more diversified. 7 and 8 is a little high, but Canada is a little thinner market in that regard. But first, they're looking at individual, the implication is, could there be collusion if they own big chunks in what could be competitors? Would they be, and first, I've never heard that seeing that happen. They're financial people, and I don't think, first of all, when they make their investments, they're going to decide to invest in 2 companies that are going to be competing head to head. I just, in a market like Canada, where it's much smaller. In the US, a lot of these groups had interests in many newspaper companies, but most newspaper companies didn't compete with one another. There was separate markets. Without having examined the data, I would say that because they have fairly small investments in each company, even so some may compete, I don't think they're too concerned about the one company undercutting another of their investments. It can happen, but again, there's a problem with any of these sources that we talk about. I think that's a minimalist problem.
Great. All right, thank you. Sergio, did you want to jump in real quick? Or I got like 30 seconds.
Yeah, 30 seconds. Basically, not completely related to both you asked, but just 2 cases. I think that going back to the question if whether institutional property or ownership would make a difference, I wouldn't. We have mixed evidence in Chile. We have some nice examples of how institutional investors, both in platform and the media sector, the content side, had generated nice outcomes. And at the same time, recently there was Time Warner owns a very important terrestrial network, and they discontinued a very relevant journalistic program because it wasn't profitable enough. Considering what you said after lunch, that in this case it was absolutely an economic consideration, and they cut it off, and that was it. So I cannot tell. Really depends on the strategy of the consortium. Sometimes the strategy would say, okay, let's foster local content and journalistic quality to differentiate with other people. In another case, it's different.
Great. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our panelists. Yeah, that's fine. Bob, if you could join